Gospel according to St. Luke, the 18th chapter. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, grant me justice against my opponent. And for a while he refused. But later he said to himself, though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. In the 1982 film, An Officer and a Gentleman, actor Richard Gere played a character named Zach Mayo, who was accepted into the U.S. Navy's Aviation Officers Candidate School. His dream, like that of his classmates, is to be commissioned as an ensign in the Navy and to one day, as he puts it, fly the jets. But unlike his classmates, however, Zach Mayo is not your typical clean-cut all-American type of guy. Instead, he's a bit of a scoundrel. Rather than simply doing things the right or the correct or even the Navy way, you see, this Zach Mayo character is always looking for an angle, a loophole, an easy way to get ahead, if you will. And he's not afraid, therefore, to manipulate others, cheat, even, if it suits his purposes. The head drill instructor, Marine Corps Gunnery Sergeant Foley, played by Louis Gossett Jr., who won that year's Academy Award as Best Supporting Actor for his performance in this film, quickly catches on to Mayo's act, however. It's Foley's job, you see, to weed out any officer candidates who he deems are unsuitable for the ultimate prize, namely a naval commission and then flight training that's worth, as he puts it, over $1 million. And believing that Zach Mayo is something of a scoundrel, a slick little hustler, as he calls him, who lacks proper motivation, is not a true team player, Gunnery Sergeant Foley then makes it his personal mission in life to ride Mayo mercilessly, with the specific aim of forcing Mayo to give up and drop out. And so when Zach's little side business of pre-shined shoes and belt buckles that he's purchased from some of the enlisted personnel on base, which then he in turn sells to some of his classmates so they can pass inspection, when that little side business is uncovered, Foley now proceeds to physically and psychologically haze him for an entire weekend. It's a final attempt, apparently, to make Mayo DOR, which stands for Drop on Request, and signifies when an officer candidate personally requests to terminate his or her training because they no longer can or want to continue. In a key scene, Foley's efforts to hound and harass Mayo into dropping out come to a climax. When asked why he's even in officer candidate school, Mayo replies that he wants to fly jets, that he's wanted to ever since he was a kid. We're not talking about flying here, says Foley. We're talking about character. I've changed, Mayo pleads. I've changed since I've been here. And Foley, however, then counters, all you've done is polish up your act. Now, Mayo is clearly at the end of his rope at this point, nearly broken both physically, mentally, emotionally, and on the verge of tears. When Gunnery Sergeant once again demands his DOR, I want your DOR, I want your DOR, spell it, D-O-R. But Mayo still refuses to give in or give up. I ain't gonna quit, he repeatedly screams out. And when Foley finally says, all right, then you can forget it, you're out, Mayo cries out in response, don't you do that, don't. And then the slick con man and hustler tearfully confesses, I've got nowhere else to go. I've got nowhere else. I've got nothing else. He won't let go, you see. He won't give in. He's smart enough, I guess, to realize that he's truly at the very end of his rope, that he's clearly out of options, that indeed he literally has got nowhere else to go. So he holds on, holds on to his dream and refuses to let go. Well, in today's reading from Genesis, we have a very similar situation, eerily similar, in fact. Because if you know or remember anything about Jacob in the Bible, it's that he too was a bit of a scoundrel, something of a con artist and a cheat. Jacob, just like the fictional Zach Mayo, was always looking for an angle, an easy way to get ahead, was not afraid, therefore, to manipulate others, even his own family, and to take advantage of them if it suited his purposes. The younger of twin sons born to Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob literally came scrambling out of the womb, says the Bible, hanging onto his brother Esau's heel, which is reportedly where he got his name, since the name Jacob is a play on the Hebrew word for heel. But the implication goes even deeper than that. The idea here is that the one who takes by the heel or follows at the heel is someone who intends to supplant or replace another. In this case, it's Jacob's older twin, Esau. And sure enough, that's exactly what this slick little hustler named Jacob proceeds to do. First, he convinces his brother Esau to sell him his birthright. In other words, Esau's right to inherit as the eldest son. And here's the thing, Jacob acquires Esau's birthright for nothing more than a bowl of stew. When Esau one day comes in from the fields famished and foolishly trades away his inheritance for a hot meal. Later, with the help of his mother Rebekah, since Jacob is clearly her favorite son, he tricks his own father into giving him the blessing, again intended for Esau as the firstborn son. At this point, you see, Isaac is old and nearly blind, as I was telling the kids a little bit ago, and Jacob dresses up in Esau's clothes, which of course carry Esau's scent or body odor on them, and then he completes the illusion at his mother's request. She's a bit of a schemer too, apparently. And he takes goatskins from the two young kids that have been prepared as a special meal, which Isaac has requested, and then he covers his arms and his neck with these goatskins to simulate his brother Esau's hairiness. Jacob, you see, was smooth skinned, we're told. So while Esau is out hunting for his father's supper, Jacob goes to see their father Isaac in his place. Now again, because he's old and nearly blind, Isaac reaches out to touch and then to smell his son to ensure that Esau gets the blessing coming to him. But Jacob, of course, dressed in Esau's clothing and therefore smelling like him, and with goatskins wrapped around his arms and neck to simulate his brother's hairiness, he tricks Isaac into giving him the blessing instead. And afterwards, once the deception is revealed, and as you can well imagine, Esau is enraged by his brother Jacob's scheming and conniving ways. Moreover, it's clearly time for Jacob, as they say, to get out of Dodge, since Esau plans to wait only until Isaac's death to exact his revenge on Jacob. But once again, their mother Rebekah intervenes on Jacob's behalf and convinces her husband Isaac to send their son away to her brother Laban, ostensibly in order for him to find a proper wife. The real reason, of course, is to get Jacob safely out of reach of his brother Esau's vengeful anger. And so once again, at his mother's request, Jacob leaves home in search of a wife and journeys to Haran and the home of her brother Laban. It's here, however, that Jacob meets his match, at least initially. Jacob, you see, is a bit of a scoundrel and con man himself, seems to run in the family on his mother's side at least. He and Jacob agree that Jacob will work for Laban for 7 years in return for Laban's daughter Rachel's hand in marriage, whom Jacob has fallen in love with, you see. But when the 7 years are up, Laban tricks Jacob into marrying his older, less attractive daughter Leah instead. The culmination of the wedding ceremony took place at night, we're told, and apparently Jacob didn't bother to look under his bride's veil before welcoming Leah instead of Rachel into his tent that evening. And though the Bible doesn't say it, I wonder if Jacob perhaps had a little bit too much to drink earlier at the wedding feast as well. Well, the next morning, when Jacob finally realizes that he's been deceived by Laban, who delivered the wrong daughter to his tent, it's too late, however. The marriage has already been consummated. It's a done deal. And so Jacob now agrees to serve another 7 years in order to finally marry Rachel, his true love, which he does. But then over the ensuing years after earning the right to marry Rachel, Jacob again reverts to form. In other words, he's back on his game, so to speak. And he now turns the tables on Laban, who agrees to give Jacob all of his spotted and speckled livestock, not knowing that Jacob would use, some would say, magical cattle breeding techniques in order to multiply them, while at the same time suppressing the fertility of the solid-colored stock that by agreement will go to Laban. And the net result being that Jacob's flocks grew, and along with them, of course, his wealth, while Laban's flocks, and correspondingly his wealth, diminished, which, as you can imagine, didn't go over so well with Laban or his sons. And so now, for a second time, Jacob's scheming and manipulative ways have worn out his wealth, and with God's urging, he decides to finally return home, where he fears, though, that he still faces the long, simmering wrath of his brother Esau. And it's during the final leg of this journey home, accompanied by his wives and children and herds and considerable wealth, that we come to this morning's reading. Just before this, however, a worried and fearful Jacob prays to God. As Linda Pepe, pastor of First Baptist Church here in Moorestown, New Jersey, once described it, he pours out his fears to God. He admits he's not worthy and acknowledges that God has nevertheless stood by him the whole time. But he also reminds God that it was God who told him to go home. It was God who told him that he would take care of him. That it was God who told him that he would give him so many descendants that he wouldn't even be able to count them. The very same promise, you may recall, that God had once made to Jacob's grandfather Abraham as well. So that same night, our reading tells us, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives and 2 maids and his 11 children, all of his wealth and possessions, and sent them on ahead across the Jabbok River, leaving himself all alone. And it's at this point that he encounters a mysterious man with whom he wrestles all night long until daybreak, never giving in despite being completely overmatched. As scholars tell us, this is one of several places in the Old Testament books of Genesis and Exodus where an ambiguous heavenly figure functions as a sort of cipher or substitute for God. Later Christian tradition, they note, depicts these figures as angels, but these early Bible stories are not so clear, however. And in our reading this morning, of course, Jacob's opponent is simply identified as a man, not an angel. But at the very end of the passage, Jacob declares that he has seen, quote, the face of God. Unless we think that this is merely some kind of dream or vision, the wrestling match is clearly real. And Jacob is left at the end of it with a real physical injury. In one of his sermons, Larry Smore writes that a favorite story of his is about a scrawny little kid from West Texas who decided one day to become a wrestler. His high school was too small to field a wrestling team, however, so he read a book on wrestling and then persuaded one of his assistant football coaches to enter him in some of the wrestling tournaments in that region. And the coach agreed to help this kid out, but the little guy was neither strong nor skillful. But he did have one enduring quality, however. He refused to give up. In fact, he won every single wrestling match he entered because he tenaciously held on to his opponents and eventually wore them down. By the end of the season, he was undefeated and made it all the way to the state finals for his weight classification. The kid's opponent in his final match was the reigning 2-time state champ and a bona fide big-time college prospect. And as the match began, the state champion made a couple of lightning-quick moves and soon had the West Texas kid on his back and about to get pinned. His coach knew that his athlete had finally met his match, was about to lose, and he couldn't bear to watch it, and so he turned his head away. But suddenly the coach heard the roar of the crowd, and when he quickly turned back around, he saw that his kid was now on top of the state champ, and he then proceeded to pin him as well. Unbelievably, he had won. Against all odds, he had won the state championship. And after his arm was raised in victory, the little guy bounced across the mat, hugged his coach, and said, "Coach, I won. I won." The coach said, "You sure did, son, but I missed it. I turned away just as I thought you were about to lose. What happened?" And the kid said, "Coach, that guy was really good. He was strong. He was tough. He had me twisted up like a pretzel on that mat. But you know me, Coach, I never quit. I refused to give up. And so I opened my eyes, and there right in front of my face was a big toe. And I don't even know if it's against the rules or not, Coach, but I bit into that toe with all of my might." Coach, it's amazing what you could do when you bite into your own toe. So even though Jacob is wrestling with and struggling against God himself in our reading this morning, the key thing here is that, like that scrawny little kid from West Texas, he won't give in despite being severely overmatched. He utterly refuses to give up and to concede defeat. Because also, like the fictional Zach Mayo in An Officer and Gentleman, Jacob realizes that he's at the end of his rope, that he's pretty much run out of options at this point, that indeed he's literally got nowhere else to go. His scheming and manipulative ways originally forced him to flee from his home and his brother's vengeful anger. And then those very same traits and behaviors forced him to flee his uncle Laban as well, whom he also cheated. What else is there for him now? And so just like Zach Mayo, he stubbornly holds on, refuses to let go, afraid of what he's left behind him, even more afraid of what awaits him. Jacob clings to this mysterious man whom he recognizes as God himself. He says to God, I will not let you go unless you bless me. I will not let you go until you bless me. I got nowhere else to go. So God, I'm not letting you go. You're stuck with me. In An Officer and a Gentleman, when Gunnery Sergeant Foley realizes how utterly committed Zach Mayo is, that he will tenaciously pursue and hold on to his dream, whatever the cost, he backs off. And ultimately, Mayo graduates Officer Candidate School with his classmates. Because he refuses to give up, because he will not let go, Foley allows him to stay and finish, and ultimately to achieve his dream of flying jets. In our reading this morning, when God realizes how utterly committed Jacob is, that he will tenaciously pursue and hold on despite the cost, God too backs off. Because Jacob refuses to give up, because Jacob will not let go, God grants him his request. God blesses Jacob. And in receiving that blessing, Jacob truly is a changed man, for no longer he is Jacob, the supplanter, the cheater, manipulator, and con man. Now, says God, you will be called Israel instead, for you have wrestled with God and with humans, and you have prevailed. Another way of translating the word prevailed is endured. And seems a little more fitting, actually, I think, because Jacob really didn't prevail or win. What he did, however, was endure. He refused to give up. He refused to let go. What Jacob had, in other words, was persistence. As Marilyn Murphy notes, it's been said that persistence is a lot like wrestling a gorilla. You don't quit when you get tired. You quit when the gorilla gets tired. In Jacob's case, of course, God got tired, but not so much tired, maybe as impressed with Jacob's tenacity, and in the end, convinced of Jacob's resolve. But just to make sure that Jacob never forgot who's who, and more importantly, who was the boss here, God struck Jacob one last time on the hip socket, as we heard, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint, an injury Jacob indeed never forgot, since it caused him then to limp for the rest of his life. The good news following this morning's reading, however, is that Jacob was eventually reunited and even reconciled with Esau, his brother. And God's blessing, originally intended for Esau, remember, but for all intents and purposes stolen by Jacob, nevertheless continued to guide and support Jacob for the rest of his life, as well as those of his family who came after him. Indeed, Jacob's new name, Israel, even became the name for all of God's people, who ultimately traced their lineage back to this slick little hustler. So where does that leave us? While you or I may not be scoundrels to the degree that Jacob was, we all probably have known, or however, will know a time when we have also wrestled with God. As Edward Marquardt notes, we spend a lot of time on the banks of our own Jabbok River. Times when we wrestle with God over our own set of problems or illnesses or tragedies or shortcomings or challenges or difficulties or sufferings or disappointments. Times when we too are at the very end of our rope. Times when we also have seemingly nowhere else to go. Times when we don't know where else to turn. And in a very real way, we too wrestle and struggle with God in these moments. St. John of the Cross called these kinds of moments the dark night of the soul. Moments of fear and despair. Moments when we feel abandoned and rejected by God. Martin Luther had them. As we learned only after her death, Mother Teresa also had them. The great Christian writer C.S. Lewis had them as well. along with countless others, both famous and anonymous, who wrestled with God just as Jacob did, looking and searching for meaning and purpose and peace in their lives. And if there's a message in today's reading, if there's a lesson to be learned here, it's simply this: do not let go. Do not let go of God. Cling to God in prayer with every fiber of your being. Endure and be persistent. Refuse to let go. But also know this: God will bless you just as he blessed Jacob. In fact, if God can even bless a despicable scoundrel like Jacob, then he can certainly bless ordinary scoundrels like you and me. Many of you probably remember the movie actor Steve McQueen, once touted as the king of cool. Success filled his life until alcohol and failed marriages left him empty. And then in his despair and his body riddled now with cancer, McQueen attended a crusade led by one of Billy Graham's associates. McQueen made a profession of faith at that crusade and afterwards requested an opportunity to speak with Billy Graham himself. And as it turns out, a connecting flight in Los Angeles allowed Dr. Graham to spend a couple of hours with McQueen in the actor's limousine. And Graham shared numerous scriptures in his quest to give the film star some spiritual hope and assurance. Apparently, Steve McQueen, not unlike the biblical Jacob, also struggled with the thought of God blessing a man who had obviously such a checkered past. In Titus 1 verse 2, a verse that Graham shared with him that day, Steve McQueen found a promise, though, that spoke to him in a powerful way. It speaks of the hope of eternal life in Jesus Christ that God, who never lies, promised us before the ages began. Upon hearing this verse, McQueen asked for something to write it down with. But Billy Graham did him one better. He gave the actor his Bible instead. And later, when Steve McQueen died in Mexico seeking experimental treatment for his terminal cancer, it said that he passed into eternity with his Bible, the one he received from Billy Graham, open to Titus 1, and his finger resting on verse 2, which reads, "In the hope of eternal life, that God, who never lies, promised before the ages began." In other words, no matter what, always remember, do not give up, never let go.